Hello, everybody. Welcome to How to Read a Tide Chart. First up is the classic tide table. Let's get rid of this pop-up. By pop-up? Okay. Classic tide table. This one kind of resembles the tide tables that you would get from a fishing shop, dive shop, or surf shop back in the day. Not even sure if they have these anymore. I haven't seen them recently, but swore by them as a kid. Just a little book about this big, and the charts inside of them look relatively like this website. This is Costa Rica Surf, crsurf.com. I use this to check the tides in Costa Rica. I probably could check Surfline for that too, but for example, when I'm planning a surf trip, I like to use their tide charts. The upshot of the tide chart is that you can see all the tides at a glance. We're going to look at the wave graphs on Surfline as well. They have a lot of awesome features. This is just a very pared down version that you can see the high and the low every day, the heights, and how it changes. So this was January 2025. And here, you could just, these are the tides, right? So we look at the first at 3:32 a.m. It was 8.94 feet. It was a low tide of 0.14 feet at 9:47 a.m., another high tide around 4 p.m., and another low tide close to the middle of the night. Some of the things you can see is that Costa Rica has semidiurnal, relatively equal tides. That means that the highs are a very similar height and the lows are a very similar height. So semidiurnal equal tides. Remember that California is also on the west coast, so this is for the Pacific coast of Costa Rica. You cannot generalize based upon what ocean it's in, whether the tide is going to be semidiurnal, diurnal, unequal, or equal. Each place, each basin has its own way of resonating with the sun and the moon. And the only way you can know that is by reading these charts or by being a scientist and getting into the other details. So this is a tide chart, and they're pretty cool. There's February, there's March, and because they're so easily laid out, again, you can just look advanced into the future. Okay, so that's a tide table, tide chart, the tide table version of a tide chart. And they are a great resource. Next, we're going to go to Surfline, and I have to say, one of the best features of Surfline is its tide graphs. Looks like I gotta sign in because I cleared my browser. Good for you guys, you can't see my password. All right, here we go. Let's just go to the Rockaways where it is incredibly flat and looks to be for the remainder of the winter. All right, so we go to this area that has all the info. Don't look at our depressing surf report, you'll get sad. And here we have the tide. So it's right here. Here we have the tide graph in wave form, right? Tide goes down, tide goes up. If I click on this, I can drag the thing across so that I could see. So it has a line when it's the peak low tide. Here at 5:30 a.m., it was a 0.7 foot low tide. And as I go up, you can see how the feet change as I get closer to the high tide. This would be an incoming high tide. So even though I'm dragging the bar this way, the tide is coming in, it's filling up until we get to the 11:41, 3.5 foot high tide. We notice the foot differentials are very different in New York than they are in Costa Rica, much larger tides in Costa Rica. That peaks high 11:40 a.m. and then drops outgoing tide. When we place the marker in the middle of the outgoing and the incoming, we get the height of the mid tide, 2.3 feet for the afternoon, and about 2.1 feet for the 2.2 feet for the morning. Another sign that in New York we have semidiurnal. That's 4 tides a day, 2 lows, 2 highs. Equal tides. The highs are very similar height and the lows are very similar height. Okay, and we can even just look at this graph right here. We just look at this in general and we see the wave heights the tide heights and dips, troughs they're called, are very, very similar. Okay, now what if we want to retroactively look at a really good surf session we had and we want to know the exact feet? We can do that on Surfline by this feature over here, the tide calendar. So you click that, we're going to click it, and it's going to give you a combination of the wave graph and the table. Pretty cool. What did I wish this had? I wish it had the moon phase. That would be amazing. So but the other feature that's cool is that you can select dates in the future and in the past. So you can see historical data and you can see projected tides into the future. That's a really cool. So let's say I don't live in Rockaway and I want to come here on April 13th through 28th. I can view the tides this way and see that the tide is dominated by a high tide in the morning and it's a low tide in the afternoon. Okay, so, and that's this 2 weeks, April 13th through April 28th. All right, so that's just a really cool feature of Surfline that you can see into the past, right? Like, let's say I haven't had an amazing surf here in ages, but let's say I wanted to see like, oh, this week in October, these 2 weeks, the waves were really good. If you can remember the date even better, and like say I surfed at 7:20, this would be there's a nice mid tide first thing in the morning on October 7th, and then maybe I remember that like around 8:55 the waves got too fat, the tide was too high, and then I can correlate that, oh, once it's about 4.3 feet, no matter what the sandbars are doing, it's pretty much like not good everywhere. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm saying that is why you would want to look at retroactive tide data. If you can remember the day that you were surfing, the sandbar conditions, and how the waves were for you. Remember that when we do surf forecasting, we're always looking at whether the waves were good for our ability level, not whether they're just good in general. There's no like real in general. It's relative to how well one surfs. One could argue that like good waves for experts are awesome for everybody to watch and see. Yeah, sure. I buy that. Yeah. Okay. So there would be like an ideal tide for expert surfers and everybody who like wants to see amazing turns and tubes and things like that and wipeouts. So sure. There are great tides for surfing at certain places and breaks in the world specifically for that expert level. But because there's way more variation on all the intermediate and beginner levels, there's more variation on what is the perfect tide for surfing. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Okay. Just wanted to drive the point home. Let's look at Ocean Beach, San Francisco, going up here. Come on. Looks like a fun day of surfing. More fun than what we have going on here. Similar thing. Wow. Forecast looking a lot better. Might have to take a weekend trip to California. So now let's look at the tide tables down here, though, because what we're doing is tide. Whoa, this does not look like what we saw for either Costa Rica or New York. I mean, we're still reading the table the same, but look, this is what it means to have semidiurnal unequal tides. We have this low tide or high tide at 2:37 in the morning, 5.5 feet. The next high tide, 3.5 feet, a 2-foot difference. So one high is much higher than the other high. 1.4 foot low in the middle of the morning. The next low tide is 3.2 feet. I mean, the next low tide is like a closer height to the high tide. All right. So radically different semidiurnal unequal tides on the west coast of California. Now, you want to trip out? I mentioned this, but you're going to trip out right now. Oh, they don't have I'll put it in right here. So check it out. This is Western Australia. not as good of a tide, not as good as a swell forecast as California, but far better than New York. Now check out these tides. We got, what? 2 tides? Yes. So let's look at their tide calendar. This is wild. Just 2 tides. This is a diurnal tide. So at 4:30 a.m. it was a 0.9 foot low. At 1:32 p.m. it's a 2. So very little difference. So here you see, sometimes the table view is just easier. And then it switches. And switches in a funny way. The next low tide is earlier in the morning. But the next high tide is later in the afternoon. I can't explain why this is. It's totally anomalous, but then look what happens as we go further, okay? So the moon is changing. The tides are getting bigger, larger variation. Just keep going, keep going. Oh yeah, wait for it. What? We have 4 tides a day on the Thursday the 27th. And then 4 tides for a while. Well, this day only has 3 tides. 4 tides, 3 tides, and then we're back to 2 tides. So it's a bit of a mixed bag down there in Western Australia. And this is why you want to pay attention to the charts so that you can figure out what the best tides for surfing are, wherever it is that you're surfing, and learn these kind of patterns, whether it's semidiurnal equal, semidiurnal unequal, diurnal and unequal. And then in this case, I think overall the pattern is diurnal, 2 tides a day in Western Australia, but then you have these interesting times. Last bit that is not on Surfline and not on that tide chart in Costa Rica is the moon phases. So you want, here's a lunar calendar, and there's a really cool one for iPhone and Android apps that's even better, but this gives you just a good general sense. It's giving it for New York because that's where I am, and it's reading my IP address. So full moon was just before Valentine's Day. We're close to the 3rd quarter today. It's the 19th. New moon is going to be the 27th, and then the 1st quarter again on March 6th. And you got a little calendar right here so that you can see in March, the full moon will be the 14th. Tides are more extreme, the highs are higher. And during the neap tides, that's during these quarter tides, that is when the lows tend to be a little bit lower, but the tides overall are less extreme. Okay, so that's how to read tide charts. If you want to map those to moon phases, get yourself a moon phase app for your phone, or just look it up on the computer. Let's see if this has there's a calendar. There's holidays, so it's just a little bit of a calendar that shows you the basic info right there. Let's see what printable. Let's see if there's a more visual one. Actually, this is really interesting too, is that right here it's just going to tell you exactly what it is. Okay, so that's it. That's how to read tides. And last bit, how do you know which is the best tide for surfing? You got to stay in touch with the tides. You got to learn to read these tide charts. You got to ask for local knowledge. Look up some things on the internet about what it says, but most of all, you need to figure out what is the best conditions for your ability level. All right? Happy surfing. You got questions? You want to follow up with any of this? Like, subscribe, comment, go over to my website. Subscribe to my zines, dr-dion.kit.com. Go into tons of detail on this stuff every week, and that also makes you eligible for surf trips and all kinds of awesome surf educational stuff. So if you like this video, definitely go over there, get into that stuff. All right. Choo. Thank you so much. Like, subscribe. Love you forever if you like and subscribe. watch my other videos. That's really cool. And if you want to know more about coaching and all things that I do, just go over to my website. Everything lives there. Archives of these videos live there. Get over there.